Oh, that's probably the hardest one. No. I am an associate professor of teaching at UBC. I'm in 2 units. One is the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, and the other is the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. Social Justice Institute for short. I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and we're all fairly spaced apart. I was the baby daughter. I grew up in a small town in Nebraska. I should say, it's a small town in comparison to Vancouver, but it was, kind of a larger city in the context of Nebraska, agricultural town. My father is Anishinaabe from northern Minnesota. His reservation is the Leech Lake Reservation. We're both enrolled there, a part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. My father was a truck driver, so again, agricultural town, and he did a lot of driving for meat packing companies and things like that. And then my mother was a Mexican-American woman. Her upbringing was as a farm worker, so again, the kind of meeting and kind of this nexus of agricultural industry in Nebraska. And interesting multicultural upbringing, I guess you would say, because our town, even though it was in a very white state like Nebraska, was very diverse because of the agricultural industry. You had a lot of people coming from all over the world to work in meatpacking and some, those lower paying industry jobs that draw lots of immigrants from all over. So, in terms of thinking about indigeneity for a long time growing up, it was something that was very personal, something that was just part of our family. I didn't really think about it. Kids, you don't really think about like, wow, I'm this person or this identity. It's just who your family is. And so I think I carry that a lot to this day, that like, it's not something I think about on a day-to-day basis, just who I am. But in terms of my experience growing up in Nebraska, most people knew our family as Mexican because that was familiar to, and also my mom's family were very much a part of the community, and aunts and uncles and cousins all lived really close by. Grandma lived with us after Grandpa died, and so most of my high school friends or elementary school friends would think of me as a Mexican girl. And that carried a lot of stigma with it in terms of the racism within my community was very much anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican. And so that was always something that was more an identity I had to navigate as a kid. And again, Mexican culture is very distinct, but it does have an indigenous component to it. And so those were some of the things that I would think about, like growing up as an indigenous Mexican girl in Grand Island, Nebraska, was sometimes really easy for me to fly under the radar because I'm light-skinned and I'm not near my indigenous community. I'm sure it was very different for my cousins growing up in Minnesota. But then also navigating that kind of duality of also like anti-Mexican racism. Of course, primarily you would think about your family as early role models, and one for sure obviously was my mother. I think everybody probably would say that. It's a fairly common answer, but she was a very hard worker. She navigated, like I said, she grew up as a farm worker, bilingual Mexican woman with lots of kids and nieces and nephews, and kind of was the heart of the family who kept everyone kind of gathering for various things. And she also was a person who, because she spoke Spanish and there are many times in my childhood that she would bring somebody home from church to live with us for a couple weeks, or someone home from work to live with us who was, newly arrived, who didn't speak the language but spoke Spanish, and she would just kind of take people in like that. So she was very generous in that way, and so that was something that she really instilled in me, was to be welcoming to any stranger or people in need. So that was somebody I really looked up to in that regard. And then ancestors too, in terms of her grandmother was a Professora, which this is the joke I tell my students, is that I thought, I was like, oh, I want to be a Professora like my grandmother, great-grandmother. And really that just means teacher in Spanish, but I was like, oh, it must mean professor, so I'm going to become a professor. So I've been wanting to be a professor for a very long time. And my uncle, Paul Buffalo, was an elder in our community who was interviewed for 13 years in his later life by an anthropologist, of course. And that anthropologist at the University of Minnesota Duluth, I'm blanking on his name right now. It'll come to me. But he has put the life ethnography of Paul Buffalo online, and so that's something I discovered very accidentally when I was just out of a master's program by just Googling my family's name and trying to find some information about my grandmother's boarding school experience, and found this thousands of pages ethnography that was all about my uncle or great uncle, I should say, and told the story of my grandparents' meeting, and just all this family history. And
I've been trying to think of how to word it, but I was just wondering how you found being Indigenous in the U.S. versus Canada, and the histories there, and how we're dealing with it now with all the reconciliation. Do you think, are there major differences? Are there, different criticisms of both, or should they even?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because it was very much a culture shock for me to come from the States for a couple of reasons. One, like I said, I grew up in a small town in Nebraska that didn't have a large Indigenous population, and then I moved to Vancouver, where we're surrounded by rich Indigenous traditions and communities that are very much politically at the forefront of all these conversations. So to come to Canada where there's a longhouse on campus and there's Indigenous student services, that is not the case in most universities in the States. We barely register as a minority that people think about. So even if you watch an Obama speech or something, occasionally he'll say, and Indigenous folks, but most of the time we just get left out. So there's that kind of difference where in the States we are oftentimes in spaces where there isn't a lot of us, very invisible to the majority of Americans in terms of our political interests, our needs, our issues. Unless you're living close to the Navajo reservation, where it's a larger population and you can see people. But Indigenous people, I feel like in the States are kind of, if they're out of sight, they're out of mind. I don't think that's necessarily the case in Canada because it can't be, because there's these large national conversations about reconciliation, the history of residential school, murdered and missing Indigenous women, the political context of BC, uncertainty around land issues, and all of those things really do have a large space for Indigenous people to be talked to. At the same time, that reflection is also it's also the danger of being visible, right? Too, is that when people see you as having a large political impact or a large political voice, or that you need to be consulted, or that you're going to protest, or that there is this kind of more of this kind in Canada. I feel a lot more. I will say this: I won't say I am Indigenous in certain contexts. I would have said in the U.S. Because in the U.S., when you're kind of out of sight, people are like, "Oh, that's interesting. That's kind of cool." But here, I've had people say really racist things to me when I say that I am Indigenous. And that was just something that was not, it just didn't occur to me. I'm used to being kind of hearing bad things about Mexican people in the States, but not necessarily Native folks. And so I find that when I tell my Canadian colleagues that, I didn't experience Indigenous racism until I moved here, they're kind of shocked by that because they think, well, Canada doesn't have racism like the States. It must be really bad. But I'm like, no, they're very similar, just dependent on who has a political voice, and then they become the kind of target of attack. Mm-hmm. And you can think about that in the American context too, like Black Lives Matter, the backlash against that. There's different ways that people, when they become politically active or powerful, then they can be also under threat. And I think those are the kinds of differences that I saw. Sure. Well, that book was really a team effort because I was a co-editor with Marjorie Fee, who's also a professor at UBC. She's emeritus now, but she was in the Department of English. And at the time I was as well, before I moved to GRSJ. She actually kind of approached me and said she wanted to do this collection of Pauline Johnson's writing because most of the collections that are out there, and Pauline Johnson was a figure that was... I think she died in 1913. Okay, now I'm going to get my Pauline Johnson facts. Read the book. But she was writing at the turn of the century. and a very popular person in her particular time. She was a celebrity in a lot of ways. Like I think I told you in class when I taught her work, when she passed away here in Vancouver from breast cancer, they shut down Granville and they took her funeral procession down Granville, and it was a very big event for the city of Vancouver. And so that's how well known she was as a writer. She wrote Legends of Vancouver, which is I think a lot of people read in elementary school. But anyway, she was a person who in her time was very famous. Quickly as the decades went on, she kind of was forgotten, like a lot of early writers were at that time period. And she was kind of revived as a person of interest for literary scholars in Canada when, a lot of English professors were looking to revisit those eras of women writing and what were women writing about. And so here was this Indigenous woman who was writing really, a huge range of different things, from poetry to short story to editorials about the representation of Indigenous women in popular literature in her time, and very critical voice, a very celebrated voice. She traveled to London to put on things and to talk, and that's where she met the Capelanos, who were important people here in Squamish territory, and that's also why she wrote Legends of Vancouver, because she forged a friendship with them after meeting them on that trip when they were there to talk to the Queen about conditions of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. So she was a celebrity, somewhat of a political figure, but she died very young. And most of the anthologies that were put together of her writing in the earlier period, or once this revival was happening, were kind of just all of her work, and not all of her work was necessarily about her Indigenous identity. She was very much a loyalist, British loyalist, so she kind of liked to wear that badge, and she liked to sing the praises of Canada. So she was kind of this like strange figure in a way that was like, on the one hand, critical of Canadian and treatment of Métis people, of her own people, of Indigenous women in print, but at the same time, she was very much, wanted to be seen as a citizen. And so, people didn't know how to read her in a way, because is she kind of celebrating assimilation, or is she, an Indigenous kind of radical voice? And, at that particular time, she was probably all of those things, and you could be that way at once. So Marjorie approached me and said, we should really put together a collection of her writings that is just on Native America. Because when you read her in this really large, broad context, it's hard to parse out those things that I think are really impactful in terms of what she was saying about Indigenous women and Indigenous experience at the turn of the century, because it gets overrun by all of the more Canadiana stuff. And so that's kind of how we had the idea. And Marjorie brought me on board. One, I think she was being a good mentor to a young Indigenous scholar at UBC at the time, younger, and wanted to, bring somebody on to be a part of that publication. But also, she really did see that my research aligned with that. And I had, kind of written about Pauline a little bit. And so she wanted to bring that kind of Indigenous feminist perspective. And the Indigenous feminism, even at the time that I was doing that, was still a very emerging conversation. It still is a very emergent conversation. There's like 3 anthologies in Canada on the subject. So I teach it every year, pretty much, when I do teach. I teach 2 things together, and this won't be a surprise to the literary folks out there, because a lot of people have written about the connections in these 2 pieces. But one is a brief editorial that she wrote that was published in the Toronto Globe, I want to say in 1892. And it's an editorial that's titled really something silly like A Strong Race Opinion on the Indian Girl in Modern Fiction. I'm sure she didn't come up with the title. I'm sure that was the editor of the paper. And so the Strong Race Opinion is her just going through all of the popular fiction novels at the time, novelists, and their appropriation or representation of Indigenous women or girls as being fundamentally inaccurate. All like the, kind of the Disney princess person who just comes in either to be the foil of the white white women in terms of a romantic interest, or to just kind of be a plot point to move on the development of the main male character. And so it was what we consider in literary studies one of the first pieces of Indigenous literary criticism, because she was an Indigenous woman writing about fiction at the time that she saw as completely misrepresenting who she was as an Indigenous woman, but also just kind of a lazy piece of writing. So she was quite harsh in saying, you guys bring in these Indigenous women characters and it's not even very good. So it's not just that it makes me mad, it's just you're just not a very good writer. So it's kind of fun to read because she's really kind of bold in her critiques of various writers at the time. And then in that, I have my students think about what is she has this term in that editorial called the Indian girl in cold type. And that Indian girl in cold type, doesn't have a family, doesn't have a surname, doesn't have a community, always betrays her community if she does have a community, all those kinds of tropes that we see are familiar and even to this day. And so she, and then she has the short story that she writes, I think a year later, it's published at least a year later, called A Red Girl's Reasoning. And in that, she has this fantastic character of Christine, who you think at the very beginning of the short story is going to be just like that Indian girl in cold type. It opens with her leaving her family to marry a white guy, to move to, I think, Toronto, or Brantford, it could be. And you think that she's falling down the same path that Pauline has just critiqued. But at the end, she kind of, flips the script, as we say. And this character ends up leaving her abusive male husband once he refuses to recognize her parents as having been legally married in Indigenous rights. And it ends with her, being an independent businesswoman in the city. And he comes to try to take her back. And she's like, no, you'll never make a slave of a red girl. And so... So those two pieces together just really, I think, written, very much at the same time, really thinking about these representations, really being revolutionary at that time to write such a strong female character. And so I find those two stories to be my favorite. I could talk about them forever. Well, there's schools named after her here in Vancouver. And so that I would start with that as her lasting impact. Of course, is she's claimed by Canadian literature as an important early writer for just development of Canadian writing because of her, her celebration of the Canadian wilderness and writing about the love of her country. So an interesting figure of thinking of a person who at the time probably wasn't wanted by Canada, but who thought of herself as Canadian. And then also, of course, first and foremost, thought of herself as a Mohawk woman who came from an very important family, and who celebrated the knowledge that her grandparents had given her. And so, and I think that's why this book was an important thing for me and Marjorie to do, because we wanted to highlight that. And then there's, many other scholars who are from her community that write about her contributions, and I would never want to step on the way that they think about her and how important she is to their community. But in terms of a kind of a broader Indigenous feminist conversation, for me, like I said, just in talking about those two pieces, that it's really important to me as a contemporary Indigenous feminist to have those early voices. I tell my students that even though Indigenous feminism is an emergent conversation, I don't want it to be seen as a reaction to a second or third wave feminism or just a cultural feminism, that it has its own roots and its own intellectual history. And I think Pauline Johnson is a part of that intellectual history that I can point to and say, look, here is a woman who was making these critiques of Indigenous women's popular representation, who wanted to change that popular representation, who became a celebrity in her own right. And so for me, that's kind of the legacy, and what I wanted to highlight in that introduction was that she is this kind of early, she wouldn't have called herself a feminist, I don't know, she might have, but even if she didn't, that we can still look to her early writing and critiques as a part of that conversation. So one of the first things I say when I teach my Indigenous feminisms, and it's a plural classes, I refuse to give a definition, but I do anyway. And part of that is that I think for a lot of feminist conversations, whatever identity or community, is that there's always been a desire to keep that category of thought and theorizing open enough that you're not excluding people. And so the hesitancy to give it a definition is to make sure that we're not excluding people who want to be a part of that conversation. For me, it is rooted in the very basic claim that colonialism had gendered formations and obviously gendered impacts. So when we think of something like murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, like, why is that a social phenomenon? How is it related to ongoing colonial policy or the historical remnants of earlier policies? How do we think about the fact that Indigenous women in some provinces make up, an overwhelming majority of the prison population in federal prisons, and such a tiny part of the actual overall population? Like, what is that reflecting in terms of these ongoing impacts? And so Indigenous feminism for me was a tool to think about telling that history of gendered colonialism, but then also talking about its contemporary impacts and ongoing impacts. And for me, doing that through the way that Indigenous women write about their life experience in fiction, poetry, and nonfiction, it gives me a way to talk about what they're saying with a political and social intervention purpose. Indigenous feminisms for a lot of people is not a category that they would see themselves in, but they still might actually have the same critiques that an Indigenous feminist might have, or the same perspective. For a lot of Native women, feminism, especially from an older generation, was seen as something that was not for us. That was a white woman's movement. It doesn't recognize the fact that we came from communities where Indigenous women had political power or status, or their own, were respected in various ways that non-Indigenous women might not have been at that particular time period. So there was a real uncomfortability with that term. For me, I think it's shorthand for a lot of things, and so I take it on as being a part of that political and social critique I want to make. But I'm not wedded to the term in terms of its. So this is this isn't the long-winded answer why I don't give a definition. Yeah. I think it is for everybody. I don't think it's solely for cis women, Indigenous women. I think it's for everybody who wants to think about gendered colonialism and why certain bodies and certain political experience happened to people under colonialism. So. And I think that conversation can be had, again, globally as well. Yeah. And that's right. And then one of the things that when I was doing my early research on Indigenous feminisms for my PhD, there was not a conversation happening in the States. In fact, it was very much, if you found anything on Native feminism in the scholarly literature, it was Indigenous women saying, again, that's not for us. We don't need that. That's a white woman's movement. And so as a burgeoning feminist, I was like, but I kind of want to say that I am. And I know that this is a political body of thought that is useful for me as there was a lot of Chicana feminism on my mom's side. But not, so I wanted to explore Indigenous feminism from that side of my identity, and not finding that in the scholarly literature was really kind of it took the wind out of my sails a little bit as a young researcher. But where I found the Indigenous feminist critical voice was in the fiction writing and the poetry and the creative writing, because, and I was like, this is the Indigenous feminist voice. Turning away from hoping to find, a theorist that says, this is what Indigenous feminism is. I had to kind of come at it through stories and poetry and kind of that stuff. I don't know, almost like code switching. You know how to speak in certain contexts and how to speak in other contexts. I know it doesn't seem so right now, but I was always a fairly quiet person. I still am a quiet person in unfamiliar territory, and so I like to kind of read the room and get a sense of the place and really figure out where can I have impact or move. And so I think being a careful, quiet person has been a way for me to navigate maybe unwelcoming or at least unfamiliar spaces. Even to this day at the university, I think I have no idea how this place works. And I'm now the president of the faculty association. Don't tell my membership. But just like, thinking about like the machinery of government and the machinery of some place like a university that some people are just very familiar with because that's their culture. And when you're coming from, a family whose parents didn't graduate high school, whose grandparents went to boarding school, those spaces can be very intimidating. And for me has been to advocate for other people who are having similar experience, first generation college students or university students. We say college in the States. University students, advocating for better, curriculum and opening spaces to different conversations. I mean, I did my PhD at Berkeley in ethnic studies. Ethnic studies wasn't a thing until the 70s. And so just trying to put myself in spaces where I can move that conversation along. It is never really, there's always this kind of worry that there's going to be a big backlash or culture shift that says, why are we doing Indigenous studies? Why should the university have something like that? Even though it seems good now, we can see in other cases where that pendulum swings back another way in terms of the political environment. I think I said this in an early interview when I first came to UBC, was to be brave. That's always something I tell myself. I'm like, okay, you got to be brave right now. Because when you walk into those unfamiliar spaces, it's really easy to kind of lose your courage, to feel like you should be there, or that you are actually, like the imposter syndrome that a lot of academics have. I think is much more acute for people, BIPOC faculty and faculty who are coming from circumstances that you wouldn't think that they would become a leader in their field. So that's, kind of the personal mantra. But also that to find those people, and this is something I have given advice to my students over and over, find those people who have gone through it, or maybe a little bit, find those mentors, but also just find a community of people that you can rant with about what X faculty member said in what meeting or in what classroom, that you can, there are people there. It might be hard to find them, but just to keep looking for that community, join the the Native Student Club, try to find those spaces and people that can help you process and feel like, again, that you are supposed to be there. I think what has served me well as a curiosity to hear other people's stories, and to share those stories with people. So I think about my teaching in that sense is that I never see myself as teaching a class as an expert on something. I'm just like a curator of all these great things that I've learned along the way. And so sharing, like, I always think about my classroom as this forum of like, let's read Pauline Johnson and let's read Leanne Simpson and let's read this. And like, aren't these people great? I always tell my students that I never put anything on the syllabus that I don't like, because life's too short for that. I put things on there that I want to share with you and have an enthusiasm for. So I think that has served me well in all aspects of various parts of my life. And when, what hasn't served me well, I think it has been those times that I have been kind of unsure of myself, worried that I wasn't quite, expert enough or experienced enough to have a say in a certain conversation. And I have regret. I think those are questions of regret where I wish I would have spoken up and said my piece and not have been scared to say it. I still feel that way about even just my own writing and publication, that there are a lot of times where I'm like, oh, I'm not going to write that. Nobody cares what I think. And that is a very strong, I think, kind of, it's a very strong sentiment that can hold a lot of people back. Like when you think about reconciling as just a verb, like that is always going to be thought of as a positive, emotion or path, or, but to reconcile, I think both parties have to know what is at stake in that reconciliation. I'm not sure that, I think Indigenous folks have a lot of thoughts on what's at stake in that reconciliation, but I'm not sure the majority of Canadians understand the history, the ongoing conditions and issues that reserves and Indigenous people have in regard to just personal safety and so the rush towards to say that we're on this path to reconciliation, I think, is very one-sided, and also then therefore perhaps not somewhat self-serving. Reconciliation also has this kind of, to me, a very it comes from a certain kind of political tradition that's kind of Christian-based kind of ideas about reconciliation and forgiveness that also has a certain tinge to it that might not be the best for an Indigenous context for various reasons. And so it's this really kind of complex conversation from like my scholarly perspective. But from an everyday perspective, like communities are very invested in having those conversations. They want to tell their stories. The kinds of conversations that can be had, or to be honest, funded by reconciliation efforts is for a lot of communities a really good and positive thing. So I try to have, on the one hand, a critical perspective. That's my scholarly perspective, and that's my job as a scholar. But on the other hand, to not be too cynical about everyday kind of movements towards better understanding, relationship building, what might fall under this large reconciliatory umbrella. Yeah, I think that's how a lot of Indigenous people feel. Is the governmental effort around it and the structure around it has its uses, and people can make use of that. But it's just the beginning of those conversations. And I think about, and I was just even thinking about the Supreme Court thing that I just said, like in the 1830s, it was settled that Indigenous folks had a certain kind of sovereignty in the states. But just yesterday, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling that took that away in a very serious. Well, it was a rethinking of the McGirt decision. And so, those things are, like I said, there's always that pendulum that can swing on a dime, where you had this really very just a decision full of just legal errors and put forth as a legitimate decision. So like those kinds of things, I think the communities are always a little bit wary about, like, there's an appetite for this over here, the ceremonial reconciliation, but when Squamish wants to build their, condo high-rise, we're like, well, I don't know about that. We didn't consult us in Kitsilano, which is ironic. And so, there's a certain way that people want to see Indigenous folks as in a particular box, and that they should make these certain decisions. But then when those decisions come up against other interests, there's a real kind of, well, I don't know. And so, yeah, I think I'm taking it in a very different direction than the spiritual part of, thinking about water and those things. But it's definitely something that you're always reminded, in one day the Supreme Court can turn on a dime about Indigenous sovereignty. And so there's that precarity that's always in the back of your mind about engaging with government and reconciliation processes. Like, those two masks. Is this a mask of friendship, or is this a mask of destruction? Yeah. Well, I think it's things like this, just having conversations in people's living room and getting to know the communities that you're around. Here in Vancouver, it's a rich opportunity because you have the host nation so close by and part of a urban experience, whereas, as like I said, growing up where I did, we were far from a reserve community, and so there wasn't a lot of Indigenous people in that town. And so it, I would say it depends on like the relationships that you can build and how accessible they are, but bringing people to tell their stories and however the way that they wanted to do it, I think is a really good practice and something that universities think they're good at, but a lot of times they're not very good at it. Like, just bringing a speaker, not really engage them, not really want to build a relationship, and so. When I think about indigenization, again, the term, as you said, it's kind of a strange term because while we share an Indigenous experience under colonialism, we might not necessarily share same philosophies, although they might be similar. So to me, it's more about kind of building local relationships if you're near a local community and really learning from them. Say, for instance, Musqueam at UBC. But if you're not in that context, just think about whose territory was this before this place was here, how I might engage that community. But also there's, so much good relationship building in a global Indigenous context. And that conversation is really emerging too. So thinking about my Maori colleagues at UBC and or Aboriginal colleagues from Australia, or, South America or Central America. Those kinds of thinking about both the local and the global and how you can kind of animate those conversations or give space to them, I think is something that universities can do because we have the resources, we have the spaces. But that's kind of a very general answer to that question. And it's one that always feels kind of pat from an Indigenous perspective, is like, we build relationships, have conversations, but really that's it. Mm-hmm.
What other creative endeavors have you engaged in?
Oh.
Apart from we're familiar with your writing, yeah.
Well, it says on my profile that I'm currently working on a book called a Red Feminist Literary History. That project is still in the back of my mind. It hasn't been worked on for a while, particularly during the pandemic. But that book, I'm really just kind of trying to pull together my reflections on important Indigenous women writers that can contribute to an Indigenous feminist intellectual tradition or literary tradition. But I also am really interested in activist women writers. And I would put Pauline Johnson in that category of people who are writing stories that, were just great stories, but also had a social kind of intervention or political intervention they wanted to make. So that really interests me, is like thinking about what do we mean by activist writers, because it can have a negative connotation to it, which there's always that idea that art needs to be for everyone and, not propaganda or too identity driven, but that doesn't really how I feel about it. So I'm kind of interested in those questions in that book. I have, as I had been working with the stories that are included in my great uncle's ethnography about my family, but also kind of digging more deeply into the National Archives of my grandmother's boarding school experience and her siblings. And so just trying to think, to me, that telling that story is something I have to be very careful about. And it's also really emotional work. And so that particular project, I keep going back to it again and again, but also not necessarily thinking, I'm still trying to work out how would I write about that in ways that's, okay with my family. But also I think there's a lot of stories like that have been, we're just beginning to tell those stories because we haven't had access to the records, or we haven't had people or access to the tools that university might give a researcher to be able to do that work on our own. Other people have done it, but in terms of our own personal histories. And so those are the two things that I kind of work on, supposedly, although even they're kind of on hold a little bit. And obviously my teaching is very important, and that is primarily around the subject of Indigenous feminisms.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Sorry, there's a lot of information. Thank you again.
This is why people don't interview professors, because we awesome. Speak in paragraphs, and it's not.